Do you remember those forgotten summer dinners, the ones you could only find in old cookbooks and nowhere else? Back then, summer dinners meant cold plates, garden vegetables, and recipes clipped and saved like little treasures for the hottest nights. What changed so quietly that we stopped making them at all? This one might raise some eyebrows today, but back in the day, pork chops with rhubarb compote were about as close to gourmet as summer dinners got. You would sear the chops in a cast-iron skillet, brown them up good, and then serve them with a sauce made from stewed rhubarb, vinegar, and a little sugar if you had any to spare. The result? Sweet, tangy, juicy, and warm. Rhubarb was a big deal back then, especially in areas where the plant grew wild or right in someone's backyard. If you had a patch, you had dinner. This recipe showed up in a lot of cookbooks because it was reliable. Even tough cuts of meat got elevated with enough rhubarb sauce on top. It was common to serve it with a scoop of mashed potatoes or white bread to soak up the juices. Not everyone liked the sharp bite of rhubarb, especially kids, but the grown-ups appreciated its practicality. It kept well, cooked fast, and paired perfectly with pork. Some versions added cloves or nutmeg. Others threw in onions or swapped the rhubarb for stewed apples when the season passed. Either way, this dish captured the feeling of summer dinners cooked low and slow with whatever you had on hand. Ham and banana casserole is one of those recipes that makes you stop and read the page twice. But once upon a time, this odd couple was a regular guest at summer dinners across suburban America. It started with slices of ham wrapped around whole bananas, arranged in a casserole dish and baked with mustard sauce poured over the top. The mustard added a tangy kick, and the bananas softened into the kind of texture that people back then thought of as fancy. Some even added shredded cheddar cheese. It was quirky, no doubt about it. But in the 1950s and 1960s, cookbooks were full of strange pairings that somehow worked. This dish was a crowd pleaser for its novelty as much as its taste. And in hot weather, it was easy to make without much fuss. It showed up at church potlucks, birthday parties, and even weeknight dinners when the fridge was running low. Today, people may cringe at the combo, but for families back then, it was just another way to stretch meat and fruit into a full meal. It is the kind of thing you might laugh at now, but remember fondly if you grew up scraping mustard sauce off your plate. Corn fritter suppers were one of those magical meals that felt light but filled you up fast. Made from fresh corn cut off the cob, mixed with flour, eggs, and a splash of milk, these fritters were dropped into hot oil until golden brown and crisp. You would pile them high on a plate, sometimes dusted with salt or drizzled with syrup if the mood called for it. But the real trick was what came on the side. Thick tomato slices, chilled and sprinkled with pepper, or a scoop of cottage cheese gave the meal its balance. This was not a starter. This was dinner. A hot, crunchy, fresh off the skillet kind of dinner that made the house smell like summer. Cookbooks from the 1940s to the 1970s were packed with corn fritter recipes, each with its own little spin. Some added chives, some tossed in bits of bacon or green pepper. But they all revolved around one thing: making corn the star. If you had a garden or access to a roadside farm stand, corn fritters were an obvious choice. They were fast, easy, and cheap, and they made everyone at the table feel like they were eating something special. Baked stuffed zucchini boats were the garden's way of saying dinner was ready. If you had zucchini growing out back, and most families did, you eventually ended up with more than you could use. That is where this recipe came in. You sliced the zucchini, scooped out the center, and stuffed it with breadcrumbs, sausage, herbs, onions, and a little cheese if you had it. Then it went into the oven until golden on top and tender underneath. The result was warm, filling, and surprisingly hearty for a dish with no meat front and center. This was not just about using produce, it was a centerpiece. In the 1960s and 1970s, garden cookbooks practically demanded this dish. It was meat-stretching, kid-pleasing, and oven-friendly. You could eat it warm or cold, toss in a tomato slice or two, and it became a full summer supper. Today it might pass as vegetarian rustic. Back then, it was just smart cooking. Cold salmon loaf with cucumber sauce looked like something from a buffet table but was made with canned fish and scraps. You flaked the salmon, canned if fresh was too much, then mixed it with breadcrumbs, eggs, lemon juice, and seasoning before shaping it into a loaf and baking. Once cooled, it was sliced and served cold, usually with a cucumber sauce made from sour cream or mayo and finely chopped cucumber. This dish showed up often in the 1950s and 1960s cookbooks, especially in regions where summer meant heat and no one wanted the stove on. Cold dinners were in. Molded ones were even better. You could make it early, chill it, and slice it up at dinner time without breaking a sweat. It was elegant in its own quiet way. Some added celery or pickles, others kept it smooth. Either way, it answered the question of what to eat when the heat made everything else unbearable. Mock chicken legs, better known as city chicken, were a Depression-era idea that stuck around. You took cubes of pork or veal, skewered them, rolled them in flour, egg, and breadcrumbs, then fried or baked them until golden. The idea was to mimic fried chicken legs when chicken cost too much. And you know what? It worked. Cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s printed this recipe again and again. In summer, these skewers were served with slaw or cucumbers, something cool to balance the heat. You could reheat them or pack them for a picnic. A pound or two of meat could feed a full family. For families in cities where meat came from the butcher, not a backyard coop, this recipe was gold. It looked like a feast, even if it was scraps. Today, you hardly see city chicken, but people who remember it still say it tasted better than the real thing. Sliced tomato pie with biscuit crust was a midsummer miracle born from the garden and the oven. Tomatoes were the star, big, juicy ones sliced thick and layered over a buttery biscuit dough pressed into a pie pan. Between the layers went onion, herbs, and sometimes cheddar or dollops of mayo, depending on the cookbook. Once baked, the tomatoes softened and sweetened, and the crust puffed up around the edges. The result was messy, fragrant, and comforting. This pie was not dessert, and it was not just a side, it was dinner. Served warm or room temperature, it filled the house with the smell of summer. Families used it to deal with too many tomatoes and a desire to skip meat. It was practical and indulgent. You could throw in corn or breadcrumbs. Some added a top crust, but most kept it open-faced. It faded when people stopped baking from scratch. But those who remember it will tell you it was magic. Stuffed green peppers with rice and corn were a humble summer dish that did not need anything extra to feel like a full meal. Peppers were halved, seeded, and filled with cooked rice, corn, chopped onions, and sometimes tomato sauce. Everything was spooned in and baked until the peppers softened, then topped with a little cheese if available. It made you feel full without being heavy. In farm communities and suburbs, peppers were easy to grow or buy cheap from roadside stands. That made them a go-to when money was tight, but hunger was not. The corn and rice stretched the filling. You could feed 6 with just a few peppers and a pan of rice. Some added beans or leftover meat, but many made the vegetarian version just fine. It was colorful. It was fragrant. It sat proudly on the table like it had something to prove. And for many summers, it did. Pineapple glazed ham steak with minted peas. Sounds fancy now, but it came from kitchens trying to make dinner fast and special. A thick slice of ham, cut from a round or canned variety, was seared in a skillet, then brushed with a glaze of pineapple juice, brown sugar, and mustard. As it sizzled, the glaze caramelized and formed a golden crust. Minted peas were the quick side, just frozen or fresh peas warmed with butter and a few mint leaves. It was fast and used shelf-stable and frozen ingredients, but it looked thoughtful. Cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s praised it for its balance and bright flavor. The pineapple made it sweet. The mustard gave it a kick. The peas kept it fresh. You could make this in 20 minutes and still feel proud. On a summer night when the house felt too still, something warm and sweet like this hit the spot. Canned peach and cottage cheese ring mold was the cold supper your grandmother swore by, and for good reason. Molded in a ring pan, it started with plain gelatin, mixed with the syrup from canned peaches, folded together with cottage cheese, diced peaches, and sometimes crushed pineapple or chopped nuts. Once set, it came out as a shimmering circle of pastel fruit and cream, served cold with a dinner roll or a spoonful of mayonnaise on the side. That might sound strange now, but this was a meal built for heat. It did not require an oven. It could be made the night before, and it was filling in that oddly satisfying way that old-fashioned suppers tend to be. This recipe showed up constantly in homemaker magazines and fundraising cookbooks during the 1950s through the 1970s. It was meant to be practical and pretty. You could make it with what you had in your pantry, and it made use of canned goods in a way that felt fresh. People served it at luncheons, baby showers, or just on nights when nobody wanted to cook. It was elegant on a dime, a little weird by today's standards, and a real piece of summer dinner history. Cold macaroni ring with tuna and peas was one of those make-ahead meals that looked like a party but tasted like pantry staples. It started with elbow macaroni, cooked and cooled, then tossed with mayonnaise, canned tuna, peas, chopped celery, and a touch of lemon juice. The whole mixture was packed into a ring mold and chilled for hours until it held its shape. Come dinner time, you flipped it out onto a plate and maybe garnished it with parsley or extra peas. This was dinner, not a side dish, and certainly not just for potlucks. It showed up in homemaker cookbooks throughout the 1950s and 1960s as a cool supper for hot days when no one wanted to turn on the stove. The peas gave it color. The tuna gave it protein. The macaroni made it stick to your ribs. You would slice it like a cake and serve it with iced tea and saltines. It was pretty in its own quiet way, and somehow it always worked. Some people added pimentos or chopped olives for flair. Others kept it plain and reliable. It is easy to laugh at a tuna ring now, but back then, it was a little miracle of convenience and charm. Stuffed tomato platters with egg salad filling were the summer version of keeping it simple without losing the charm. You would start with the ripest tomatoes you could find, usually picked right from the garden or bought cheap from a neighbor's stand. Slice them in half, scoop out a bit of the center, and fill them with homemade egg salad. Not the store-bought kind either. This egg salad was chopped eggs, mustard, a bit of mayonnaise, and maybe a sprinkle of paprika or chopped pickle for punch. Then the filled tomatoes would be plated on a bed of lettuce, often with saltines on the side, and a tall glass of iced tea. This was not a lazy meal. It was intentional, refreshing, and bright. The kind of plate that made you feel taken care of even when money was tight and the kitchen was sweltering. These showed up at bridge club meetings, baby showers, and Sunday dinners when nobody felt like cooking. The tomatoes cooled the egg salad. The lettuce gave it a little crunch. And if you were lucky, someone would have tossed in some sweet relish just right. The whole thing was cold, clean, and deeply satisfying. A real taste of summer simplicity. Bologna salad sandwich plates were the quiet champions of summer dinners when the fridge was nearly empty, but you still needed something that felt like a meal. You would take bologna, thick cut or leftover slices, run it through a grinder or chop it by hand, then mix it with mayonnaise, sweet relish, and maybe some mustard if you liked a little zip. The resulting spread was scooped onto a leaf of butter lettuce, arranged on a plate with a couple of pickles, and served cold with slices of white bread or a few crackers on the side. This was not the same as a bologna sandwich you slapped together in a hurry. This was the dressed-up version, the dinner version, and for a lot of families in the 1950s and 1960s, it was enough to make the evening feel just a little more put together. Iced coffee or sweet tea on the side made it feel like a full meal. It might sound modest now, but it filled bellies and made do with what was on hand. People were proud of their spreads. Some added chopped celery. Others blended in boiled eggs or diced pickles. Every house had its twist. Lemon chicken with jellied beet rings was the kind of dinner you would find chilling in the fridge under a layer of wax paper, waiting for the hottest part of the day to pass. The chicken was marinated in lemon juice, olive oil, garlic, and herbs, then roasted and cooled until tender. It was sliced and arranged on a serving platter, often surrounded by rings of beets suspended in gelatin. Those beet rings were not just for show. They had a hint of vinegar and sugar and were considered the perfect cold contrast to the lemony chicken. This dish came from a time when summer dinners were not about heat or effort. They were about balance. Something bright, something chilled, something that did not ask too much from you but still looked beautiful on the table. Housewives took pride in plating this just right. You might see it served with a sprig of parsley or a wedge of hard-boiled egg for color. It was the kind of cold meal that made people feel like they had a secret trick for beating the heat. Some recipes added mint to the marinade. Others leaned heavier on garlic. Either way, it was refreshing and light, perfect for August. Ham and noodle ring with creamed corn center sounds like something out of a school cafeteria, but it was once the crown jewel of many a 1960s dinner table. You would mix up a batter of cooked egg noodles, chopped ham, eggs, cheese, and a bit of milk, then press it all into a ring mold and bake until set. The middle was left empty until serving time, when you would ladle in creamed corn, warm, buttery, and just thick enough to hold its shape. This was a one-dish dinner meant to serve a crowd with the illusion of elegance. Kids loved the noodle ring part, while the adults appreciated how cheap it was to make. Cookbook after cookbook recommended it for Sunday suppers or ladies' luncheons. It looked fancy, but it was made from pantry basics. You could dress it up with paprika or parsley. You could swap the corn for peas if that was all you had. But no matter how you spun it, this was comfort food in a circle. A little weird, a little showy, and very much a product of its time. Still, on a hot night when you needed a filling meal fast, it did the job well. Sliced cold meatloaf with celery relish was the kind of meal that quietly held families together through long, hot summers and tight grocery budgets. After meatloaf night, what came next was almost better. Thin slices of the chilled loaf served on a plate with a scoop of tangy celery relish on the side. That relish was simple: chopped celery, onion, a dash of vinegar, maybe a pinch of sugar if you wanted to get fancy. The contrast between the dense, savory meat and the bright crunch of the relish made this leftover dinner feel like its own occasion. White bread or saltines were standard sides and no one complained. This showed up in a lot of mid-century cookbooks as a suggestion for next-day meals. It was easy. It was cheap. It felt satisfying without being heavy. And in houses where meat was stretched thin, turning leftovers into something new was a skill people were proud of. Some folks made their meatloaf with oats or breadcrumbs to stretch it. Others added bell peppers or hard-boiled eggs in the center. No matter the version, this cold plate dinner was a reliable summer staple that tasted better the second day. Garden vegetable casserole with saltines was not just a way to use up the harvest, it was practically a tradition by the end of July. People who grew their own zucchini, tomatoes, onions, and yellow squash always reached a point where there was too much to eat fresh. That is when this casserole came out. You would chop up whatever vegetables you had, sauté them lightly in a skillet with butter and herbs, then pour them into a baking dish. The top was crushed saltine crackers tossed with melted butter, baked until crisp and golden. It was crunchy, steamy, and deeply comforting in that way only garden food can be. The vegetables were never the same from house to house or even week to week. Some people added cheese or cream of mushroom soup for a richer version. Others kept it simple and let the vegetables speak for themselves. What mattered was that nothing went to waste. This was the clean-out-the-fridge dinner that ended up being a family favorite. It showed up in old spiral-bound church cookbooks and recipe boxes everywhere. Served with a glass of cold milk or a slice of watermelon, it was summer on a plate. Cheese-stuffed eggplant with tomato gravy was how people in the 1960s made vegetarian food feel hearty, long before it was trendy. Eggplants were halved, scooped out, and filled with a mixture of breadcrumbs, grated cheese, chopped eggplant, and herbs. Some folks added onions or olives. Once stuffed, the eggplants were placed in a baking dish and covered with a slow-simmered tomato gravy, thicker than a sauce but smoother than a stew. It bubbled in the oven until the tops were golden and the gravy had soaked into every crevice. You would serve it warm or room temperature with a fork and knife and maybe a slice of buttered toast. This dish showed up in Italian-American households and made its way into countless home cookbooks aimed at budget-conscious cooks. It used up what was in season. It filled bellies. It reheated well. And it felt like something special, even if you made it with grocery store odds and ends. Some versions used Parmesan, others went big with cheddar, but all of them were built on the idea that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. It was thrifty, it was rich, and it was worth every bit of oven heat on a summer day. Barbecue Spam kebabs with pineapple might sound like a dare today, but back then, they were a summer dinner everyone looked forward to. Cubes of Spam were skewered with chunks of canned pineapple, green bell peppers, and onion slices, brushed with a simple barbecue sauce made from ketchup, brown sugar, and vinegar. Then they were grilled or broiled until sticky and sizzling. It was fast, it was fun, and it felt just exotic enough to make a weeknight dinner feel like a party. This recipe popped up all over mid-century cookbooks, especially those geared toward quick meals and outdoor cooking. Spam was cheap, shelf-stable, and already cooked, so you could focus on getting the glaze just right. Kids loved the sweetness. Grown-ups appreciated the convenience. You could serve it over rice, pack it for a picnic, or lay it on a bed of shredded lettuce if you wanted to be fancy. Some variations added maraschino cherries, others swapped in hot dog slices or Vienna sausages. But the message was always the same: make dinner fun, fast, and easy. It might not win points for elegance, but it was dependable. And during the summer, that counted for a lot. Creamed chicken and cucumber boats was a cool, crisp dinner plate that looked fancy but cost next to nothing. You would poach or roast chicken, usually left over from another meal, chop it up fine, and mix it with mayonnaise, salt, pepper, and maybe a little celery or onion. Then came the cucumbers. They were sliced in half, seeds scooped out, and filled with the chicken mixture like a tiny canoe of creamy goodness. Served cold with a dinner roll or some fruit on the side, this dish was perfect for heatwave nights when even looking at the stove felt like too much. It was elegant enough to serve at a luncheon, simple enough to pack in a picnic, and hearty enough to count as dinner. The cucumbers gave it bite. The chicken made it filling. And the mayo held everything together like a smooth little hug. This dish was big in the 1950s and 1960s cookbooks under cool plates or cold suppers. Some people added curry powder. Others used sour cream instead of mayonnaise. No matter how you dressed it up, the goal was the same: serve something light, cold, and pretty that made dinner feel easy again. And for a while, it absolutely did. Shrimp and rice salad mold was one of those cold suppers you made when guests were coming over and the kitchen was already too hot to breathe in. The dish started with cooked rice, canned shrimp or small boiled ones, green peas, and chopped celery, all stirred into mayonnaise and lemon juice. Then it was poured into a gelatin base and set in a ring mold. By dinner time, you had a shimmering pink and white circle that wobbled gently when served. It looked fancy, and back then, that was part of the charm. Housewives in the 1950s and 1960s made it for luncheons or just to feel prepared. The shrimp felt upscale. The gelatin kept it together. Served cold on a bed of lettuce with saltines or tomato wedges, it was a slice of effort-free elegance. Today it might look dated, but once upon a time, this was the cleverest dish on the table. Cold ham and asparagus roll-ups were the tidy little summer plate that turned up in every women's magazine from the 1950s to the early 1970s. You took canned asparagus spears, soft, salty, and already cooked, and rolled them up in thin slices of ham. A drizzle of French dressing or a mix of mayonnaise and lemon juice went on top. The whole tray was chilled and served cold, usually with cottage cheese, crackers, or potato salad on the side. It was light, fast, and just formal enough to count as dinner. These roll-ups showed up everywhere: church luncheons, baby showers, or quiet Sunday nights when no one wanted to cook. Some people added a slice of pickle in the center. Others swapped in turkey or added paprika for color. They were practical, portioned, and surprisingly satisfying. Not bad for something made in under 10 minutes with only a can and a fridge. Curried fruit and chicken salad plates were what you made when the heat said no to ovens and your pantry said yes to creativity. Leftover cooked chicken was chopped and tossed with canned pineapple, peaches, or mandarin slices, whatever you had on hand. A mayonnaise dressing seasoned with curry powder held it all together, giving the dish a warm, savory bite that cut through the sweetness. It looked elegant on a bed of lettuce with crackers, especially for how little effort it took. You could find it in homemaking magazines under cool plates or no-cook suppers. Some versions added coconut or raisins. Others stayed plain and tidy. Either way, it hit the mark. Cold, filling, and just different enough to feel like something special. This was not a salad for show. It was a dinner that worked when everything else felt like too much. Cabbage and hot dog stir-fry skillet might sound like a punchline now, but back in the 1970s, it was a weeknight hero. Cabbage was cheap, easy to slice, and filled the pan fast. Hot dogs were sliced thin and browned in a skillet until the edges curled, tossed in with the cabbage and a splash of vinegar. That was it. A whole dinner in one pan. No oven, no sides, and no leftovers if you were lucky. Cookbooks called it budget-friendly, but families just called it practical. The cabbage softened and soaked up every bit of flavor from the meat. It was salty, warm, and surprisingly filling. Some people added onions or cracked in an egg for extra bulk. But even plain, it made a tough day easier. It was not elegant, but it was honest. Dinner got made, everyone ate. Sometimes that was more than enough. Tuna stuffed bell peppers with pickle relish were about as thrifty and tidy as a summer dinner could get. The peppers were halved and hollowed out, their crisp shells filled with a mix of canned tuna, mayonnaise, chopped celery, and sweet pickle relish. Sometimes a spoonful of mustard made it tangier. Chilled in the fridge and served cold with crackers or a boiled egg, it was simple but satisfying. It appeared in homemaker cookbooks and church fundraiser recipe cards, always in the section for summer suppers. The crunch of the raw pepper and the creamy tuna mix made each bite feel balanced. Everyone got their own neat portion. Some folks sprinkled paprika on top or added chopped onion for a little punch. It was not glamorous, but it worked, and in a hot kitchen with few groceries and no energy to cook, that was everything. Swiss steak with summer okra stew was a meal that felt heavy in spirit but light in ingredients. Beef round or chuck was pounded flat, floured and browned in a skillet, then simmered slow in tomato sauce until fork tender. Beside it came the okra stew, made with chopped okra, tomatoes, onions, and garlic, simmered until the okra melted into the sauce. It was a southern favorite, showing up in cookbooks year after year during the summer harvest months. Families served it over white rice or mashed potatoes, depending on what they had. The okra gave it a depth that stuck to the ribs even without a lot of meat. Sometimes people added bell pepper or bacon for more body. It was a dish made from patience, scraps, and heat that already hung thick in the air. But once it was done, it tasted like comfort. Chilled potato ring with liver sausage center was one of those molded dinners that told you exactly what kind of summer it was: hot, tight-budgeted, and desperate to keep the oven off. Mashed potatoes were seasoned, sometimes stretched with milk or a dash of butter, and then packed into a ring mold to chill. The center? A spreadable sausage blend, usually liverwurst or Braunschweiger, mixed with relish or mustard, then piped or spooned right into the middle. Once flipped onto a serving plate, the ring stood firm and cold, garnished with parsley or pickled onions if you wanted to impress. People sliced it like cake, spreading the potatoes and sausage onto crackers or white bread. It showed up in mid-century homemaking magazines as a no-cook miracle, especially in those sections titled Cool Suppers or Meatless Mains. It was strange, sure, but for families juggling rising food prices, hot kitchens, and limited meat, it was also clever and oddly comforting. Baked frank and bean pie with biscuit topping was not trying to be elegant. It was trying to get dinner on the table fast. You took a can or two of baked beans, stirred in sliced frankfurters or leftover hot dogs, poured it into a dish, and dropped biscuit dough on top. That was it. No fancy layering. No secret step. Bake until the biscuits puffed up and browned, the beans bubbled, and the whole dish smelled like summer camp in the best possible way. This dinner showed up again and again in handwritten cookbooks and church fundraisers during the 1960s and 1970s. It was made from pantry staples. It was cheap, and it always disappeared from the pan. The beans added sweetness, the frankfurters added smoke, and the biscuits made it feel complete. No sides required. For tired parents, it was a godsend. For hungry kids, It was comfort food. And for hot summer nights, it was easy. Zesty cottage cheese and olive salad plate might not sound like a full dinner today, but back in the 1950s and 1960s, it was a go-to for anyone looking to eat light and stay cool. The cottage cheese was piled into a neat little mound, sometimes seasoned with celery salt or paprika, then topped with green olives, often pimento stuffed and sliced into little wheels. Some recipes added lettuce leaves underneath. Others called for shredded carrots or radishes to go around the edge. It was cold, it was salty, it was fast, and most importantly, it made people feel like they were eating something clean and purposeful. This was not a meal built to impress. It was built to help you survive a 100-degree day without boiling pasta or frying anything. Magazines called it figure-friendly. Homemakers called it a break. With crackers on the side and a tall glass of iced tea, it did its job without a fuss. Pimento macaroni loaf with tomato aspic was not exactly photogenic, but it was a summer dinner with a surprisingly loyal fan base. You started with elbow macaroni, stirred in chopped pimientos, cheese, eggs, and milk, and poured the mixture into a loaf pan to bake until set. Once cooled and sliced, it held its shape like a cake. The real twist came from the tomato aspic, gelatin made from seasoned tomato juice, spooned over the top or served in slices beside it. Tangy, cold, and just a bit rubbery, it shocked modern palates but was considered refreshing back then. These kinds of meals were all over mid-century cookbooks, especially under the summer main dishes section. You could find endless variations. Some added chopped celery, others swapped cheddar for American cheese. The dish may not have screamed sophistication, but it was thrifty, filling, and made entirely without fuss. Back then, that was enough. There was a time when vegetables weren't just steamed and forgotten on the side of the plate. They were the star of the meal. This dish took humble cauliflower and elevated it to something rich, comforting, and undeniably satisfying. Baked in a velvety cheese sauce and topped with golden breadcrumbs, creamy cauliflower gratin was a favorite at homecoming dinners, potlucks, and holiday tables alike. Cauliflower was once an affordable and widely available vegetable, appreciated for its versatility. It absorbed flavors beautifully, making it a natural pairing for creamy, cheesy sauces. The gratin method, borrowed from classic French cooking, ensured that every bite was infused with deep, savory richness. The top layer of breadcrumbs added just the right amount of crunch, creating a contrast that kept each forkful interesting. Some home cooks added a pinch of nutmeg or mustard to enhance the flavor, while others used a mix of cheeses for extra depth. So why did it fade from dinner tables? As frozen and canned vegetables became more common, fresh cauliflower lost its appeal. Many home cooks swapped slow-baked dishes for quicker, less labor-intensive sides, and gratins became associated with special occasions rather than everyday meals. Native American preparations of stuffed roast duck usually included some common themes like wild rice, corn and beans, acorns, and nuts, but it varied region by region. What really makes this such a standout recipe for dinners is that it is quite literally an entire stuffed duck. This is also something you need, such as minimal appliances for making. It can be its own little day, too. So, if you're feeling like calling a friend over and brushing up your cooking skills over the weekend, this might be a good idea. The stuffing is also not something you need to worry about too much because it's not that hard to make. In California and the Southwest, ground acorns and pine nuts had a long tradition of being thickened into stuffing, and this was usually for pies, but the Native Americans thought it was better with ducks. The use of berries and fruits is definitely something I'm not used to, though, and I don't think a lot of people are. Many tribes like the Cherokee and Lenape would use dried cranberries and choke cherries in a fair amount of recipes, but in terms of stuffed duck, it was always used to add a bit of an extra sweetness to it. I think the most difficult part of this might be just managing the bird, because Native Americans would roast the duck whole. This is obviously something we aren't really used to, but if you really want to get authentic with it, you should try cooking it over an open fire. This ensured a lot more even cooking, and the meat would get really tender on the inside, besides just having a slightly smokier flavor. And that's never a bad thing. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Okay. This southern staple might still be a thing in some parts of the country, But let's be real, biscuits and sausage gravy is definitely not dominating breakfast menus anymore. I guess waffles are to blame for that. But this breakfast legend is the perfect combination of fluffy buttermilk biscuits so light and airy they practically melt in your mouth, along with a creamy sausage gravy, rich with savory sausage and speckled with black pepper. This is a breakfast, or hey, no judgment here, even a dinner combination that's pure comfort food heaven. From the perfect hangover cure to a delicious weekend treat, biscuits and sausage gravy satisfy all cravings. Just maybe lay off the white clothes while you're indulging. That sausage gravy can be a bit enthusiastic when it comes to staining. Venison is one of the most common meats throughout all of history, so it's no surprise that the Native Americans have their own nutty take on it as well. In forests and grasslands, deer would usually thrive a lot more than what we're used to. There used to be, like, massive packs of them roaming around everywhere. Before the 20th century, also, the American chestnut tree was in its golden years. It was devastated later by regional hazards and blight. Chestnuts were something that were available all over eastern woodlands, so it was very easy to forage them and gather them for emergency situations. Venison was always a staple meat for all kinds of tribes, especially the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Algonquians. Deer was something that was respected by tribes for how much the animal would take care of them. It would give them hides for clothing, the sinew was used for tools, and the bones were used in medicinal broths and kept for trading or for hunting tools. The meat was also very flavorful and important for making pemmican, which was a superfood essential to the Native Americans. Venison was usually cut into cubes and put into a broth with roasted and peeled chestnuts. They would be fond of using Jerusalem artichokes, squash, and wild onions as well, so stock up on your root vegetables before trying this. Leftover turkey was once the foundation of creative home cooking. Long before frozen dinners and deli slices, resourceful cooks found ways to repurpose every part of a roasted bird. One of the most inventive solutions? A golden, bubbling gratin that transformed shredded turkey into something just as satisfying as the holiday feast itself. Sweet potatoes, naturally rich and slightly sweet, paired perfectly with the savory depth of turkey. Thinly sliced and layered, they acted as both a starch and a built-in flavor enhancer. A cheesy herbed cream sauce seeped into every bite, bringing a velvety richness that made this dish feel indulgent despite its humble origins. Some families added a pinch of nutmeg for warmth, while others topped it with breadcrumbs for a golden, crispy finish. For decades, this dish was a practical way to extend a meal and avoid food waste. Turkey was affordable, especially in the days when whole birds were purchased rather than prepackaged cuts. Sweet potatoes, widely available and inexpensive, provided both nutrition and flavor. As quick-fix meals and processed leftovers became the norm, dishes requiring careful layering and slow baking lost their appeal. I think this one might actually work better as a cool history fact, instead of a Saturday dinner you're investing in. But hey, trying new things is cool too. There's definitely nothing as new as a roasted prickly pear cactus for dinner, but to us, it's just an out-of-the-box idea. To them, it was a pretty standard dinner. In arid regions like the Southwest, where cactus growth was always something you would expect, both the pads and the fruit were always eaten. However, cactus on its own isn't exactly the most palatable thing, so roasting it would really help with that. They had a whole specific preparation process for the cactus too. The pads would be harvested when they were young and tender, and before that, they also become very full of fiber. This was good back then because it meant they could be full for a lot longer, and a lot of food and meal plans were designed for sustainability rather than just for the thrill of it. Still, removing the glochids, otherwise known as the spines of the cactus, was as painful as you could imagine. They had tricks for making it quicker, but it was a pain. Native Americans would usually burn off the spines over open flames, or they would scrape them off or cut them with knives. They would also boil them sometimes to loosen the spines. It's definitely one recipe that's really out there, right? Also, interestingly enough, the cacti had a lot of medicinal benefits, like an incredible amount of fiber, a lot of vitamin C, and intense hydration. The Hungarians really killed it with dinners that shaped our childhood, because we've got another banger on the list. Hungarian goulash was everyone's favorite cozy, hearty meal back in the day. Goulash is a hearty stew whipped up with tender chunks of beef simmered in a rich, savory sauce brimming with paprika. Yeah, paprika was huge back in the day. So why did this delicious dinner vanish from our dinner tables? Well, the Hungarian goulash traces back as far as the 10th century to stews eaten by the shepherds, so you can say this one might just have run its course. But hey, if you're ever craving goulash, dust off some old cookbooks and get to work because it really isn't hard to wump up. This is the perfect dish for a chilly night in, curled up on the couch with a good movie. Just be careful not to spill it on your mom's vintage tablecloth. Those things are irreplaceable. Few dishes command attention quite like a well-prepared crown roast. Traditionally served at homecoming dinners and holiday gatherings, it was the kind of dish that made guests stop and admire before the first bite. The ring of bone-in pork chops, arranged in a regal circle, was as much about presentation as it was about flavor. For families looking to impress without breaking the bank, the pork crown roast was a surprisingly economical choice. Pork was, and still is, one of the most affordable meats, and butchers often offered deals on bulk cuts. The apricot glaze, a key feature of this recipe, added just the right balance of sweetness and depth, while a bread-based stuffing packed the center for an even heartier meal. Preparing this dish took skill and patience. The roast had to be properly Frenched, tied, and slow-cooked to achieve that juicy, tender texture. But for many home cooks, the challenge was worth the reward. Unfortunately, as home butchering became a lost art and families shifted toward convenience meals, the crown roast started to disappear from dinner tables. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt-in-your-mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinner-time classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days, it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. For generations, lamb was a prized centerpiece of homecoming feasts and holiday gatherings. Its deep, rich flavor and fall-apart tenderness made it a dish reserved for special occasions, especially in families with European or Mediterranean roots. Slow roasting a lamb shoulder with garlic and fresh herbs was a time-honored tradition. Lamb was once far more common on American dinner tables than it is today. In the early 20th century, it was an affordable alternative to beef and pork, particularly in rural areas where small-scale farming was the norm. Shoulder cuts were especially budget-friendly, benefiting from long, slow cooking to break down tough fibers. Roasted low and slow with rosemary, thyme, and whole cloves of garlic, the meat absorbed deep, aromatic flavors while becoming melt-in-your-mouth tender. So why did it disappear from everyday meals? As industrial farming shifted American preferences toward beef and chicken, lamb fell out of favor. It became harder to find in grocery stores, and for many home cooks, its distinctive flavor was an acquired taste. Faster, more convenient proteins replaced slow-cooked roasts, and over time, this once popular dish faded into obscurity. Scalloped chicken casserole. Here's another classic casserole that deserves a comeback. This dish is the perfect example of simple but mouth-watering good. I mean, just imagine tender chicken pieces in a creamy sauce, seasoned to perfection, and layered with fluffy breadcrumbs. I think I'm feeling hungry now. Scalloped chicken casserole is a great way to use up leftover chicken, and it's perfect for a quick and easy weeknight meal. Not to mention, it's a dish that's sure to please even the pickiest eaters. Who can resist creamy chicken and crispy breadcrumbs? Ditch your takeout menus for a night and take a trip down memory lane by giving this casserole a try. You can find dozens of recipes on the internet, and it won't take you hours to whip up. Trust me, your taste buds will thank you. There was a time when meatloaf was a household tradition. Made from simple, inexpensive ingredients, it was a staple of weeknight dinners and homecoming feasts alike. But what made this version special was the glaze, a perfectly balanced mix of ketchup and brown sugar that caramelized into a sticky, flavorful coating as it baked. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins, and by mixing it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, home cooks could stretch a single pound to feed an entire family. Some variations included oats or crushed crackers, while others relied on Worcestershire sauce and mustard for added depth. But the secret weapon was always the glaze, a blend of sweet and tangy flavors that sealed in moisture and gave the loaf its signature glossy finish. So why did this dish start disappearing from dinner tables? As dietary trends shifted, meatloaf's reputation took a hit. Low-carb diets, leaner meat choices, and a move away from home-cooked comfort foods made it less popular. Pre-made frozen meatloaves also contributed, offering convenience at the cost of homemade flavor. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Once a staple of dinner parties and homecoming feasts, this elegant yet simple side dish was a favorite among home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to their meals. Crisp, tender green beans, lightly sautéed in butter and finished with toasted almonds, struck the perfect balance between freshness and richness. Green beans were one of the most accessible vegetables in American kitchens. Whether fresh, frozen, or canned, they were affordable and widely available year-round. Almonds, though slightly more expensive, were used sparingly, adding a crunchy contrast without overwhelming the dish. The preparation was straightforward. The beans were quickly blanched to preserve their bright color and firm texture, then tossed in a buttery skillet with slivered almonds for a nutty, golden brown finish. Some recipes included a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of garlic for extra depth. But as convenience cooking took hold, green bean almondine slowly faded from dinner tables. Canned green bean casseroles, loaded with processed ingredients, became the new standard, and simple, fresh preparations were overlooked in favor of heavier, creamier alternatives. Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. Once a humble staple of farmhouse kitchens, savory sweet onion pie was a testament to how simple ingredients could be transformed into something extraordinary. With its flaky crust, velvety custard, and layers of slow caramelized onions, this pie was both comforting and surprisingly elegant, a dish that fit just as well on a holiday table as it did at a casual family dinner. Onions have long been one of the most affordable and widely available vegetables, making them a practical choice for home cooks looking to stretch their budget. When cooked low and slow, their sharp bite mellowed into a deep, natural sweetness. Combined with eggs, cream, and sometimes a sprinkle of cheese, they created a rich, quiche-like filling that was both satisfying and economical. Some versions leaned into the southern tradition of sweet onions, using vidalias to enhance the dish's natural sugars. So, why did this once popular pie disappear? As savory tarts and quiches became more associated with upscale brunches rather than home-cooked meals, hearty onion-based dishes faded from everyday menus. The rise of pre-made frozen quiches also contributed, making from-scratch versions less common. Hear me out, this one might sound a little boring at first glance, but trust me, it's a classic for a reason. The split pea soup is a hearty, filling, and surprisingly healthy-ish, thick, creamy soup packed with vibrant green split peas and other vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions. Now, on that healthy-ish claim, it depends on how much butter and cream your grandma used. The split pea soup is the kind of soup that leaves you feeling satisfied for hours. It has been a St. Patrick's Day staple ever since its origin in 1905. The best part? You can totally customize it according to your liking. Yeah, don't be shy to throw in your favorite veggies, add a splash of lemon juice for a bit of brightness, or even some leftover shredded chicken for an extra protein punch. We really need to bring this one back. For years, cornbread stuffed pork tenderloin was a homecoming dinner favorite, combining the rich, juicy flavors of pork with the comforting, slightly sweet notes of cornbread dressing. It was the kind of meal that felt celebratory but was made with everyday ingredients. Pork tenderloin was an affordable cut, prized for its tenderness and quick cooking time. Cornbread, a staple in southern and midwestern kitchens, made the perfect stuffing, absorbing the juices from the meat while adding its signature crumbly texture. Sage and dried cranberries brought a hint of warmth and sweetness, making this dish a natural fit for fall and winter gatherings. Some versions included pecans for extra crunch, while others used sausage to double down on the savory depth. So why did this dish fade from dinner tables? As boneless, pre-seasoned pork cuts became common, elaborate stuffed roasts became less appealing to the average home cook. The extra steps of butterflying, filling, and tying up a tenderloin made it feel like a holiday dish rather than a weeknight option. But for those who appreciate the balance of savory pork and buttery cornbread, this is a recipe that deserves a second look, because some traditions are too good to leave behind. Few dishes capture the culinary experimentation of the late 20th century quite like this one. With its bold combination of prunes, olives, capers, and white wine, chicken marbella was a breakout star of the 1980s dinner party scene. It was elegant, unexpected, and a perfect example of how sweet and savory flavors could work together in harmony. The recipe originated from the Silver Palette Cookbook, a landmark 1982 publication that introduced home cooks to sophisticated yet approachable recipes. What set this dish apart was its unique balance. Briny olives and capers cut through the sweetness of prunes, while white wine and vinegar created a tangy, aromatic sauce. Chicken, an affordable and versatile protein, absorbed the flavors beautifully as it marinated overnight before baking. Despite its popularity, chicken marbella eventually faded from home kitchens. As the 1990s brought a shift toward faster, simpler meals, dishes requiring overnight marination and complex flavor profiles became less common. The rise of international cuisine also introduced new, trendy flavors that overshadowed this once-beloved classic. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. Wild boar roasts were a pretty common activity for Native Americans, but it wasn't something that they came up with. This was actually something they took from the Europeans for once. It was brought over to America by European explorers active during the 16th century. They brought it over in the Southwest, but native species began to spread over to the Southeast after continuous hunting. Tribes like the Creek and Seminole eventually adapted and began to incorporate boris into their diets as well, using their own traditional methods like roasting and pit cooking. The wild boars were really tough to hunt though, but they got pretty good at hunting them down too because of their experience with bows and spears. Some cool military facts. Now, they wouldn't eat the boars as soon as they got them. These were actually mostly preserved for the winter because of the massive amounts of meat they would give. Remember when your mom used to whip you up lunch for school along with a heartfelt note and a sweet treat? Meat and potato patties were a staple back in the day and a hit in the lunchbox. If you've got some leftover mashed potatoes lying around, you've got to try these. Yeah, these are basically patties made out of mashed potatoes combined with seasoned ground meat, shaped into little discs, and fried till golden brown. They pair perfectly with ketchup, your favorite dipping sauce, or even a dollop of sour cream for a tangy twist. Meat and potato patties are the ultimate finger food that is still a hit to this day. Well, with McDonald's French fries on the rise, these really don't make an appearance that often, but you can whip these patties up anytime. They're surprisingly easy to make. Just give your mom a call and ask for the recipe. For decades, this dish was the definition of hearty, home-cooked comfort food. A cross between a hamburger and a meatloaf, Salisbury steak offered all the savory satisfaction of a beefy main course, without the expense of premium cuts. Smothered in a rich mushroom and onion gravy, it was often served alongside mashed potatoes, soaking up every last drop of its flavorful sauce. The origins of this dish date back to the late 19th century when Dr. James Salisbury, a physician, promoted chopped beef as a health food. But it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it became a household favorite, especially during the post-war years when ground beef was an affordable, versatile staple. Mixing the meat with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings helped stretch a family's grocery budget, making it a go-to recipe for filling, cost-effective meals. The cooking process was simple yet rewarding. The beef patties were seared to lock in flavor, then simmered slowly in a rich, savory gravy made from beef broth, onions, and mushrooms. The rise of frozen TV dinners turned Salisbury steak into a mass-produced meal, often losing the homemade taste that made it special. Back in the 1950s, the Divan Parisian restaurant at Chatham Hotel in New York City gave birth to its signature dish, the chicken divan casserole. This mouth-watering dish soon found its way to all our homes, and I'm not complaining. It's made of tender chicken pieces nestled amongst vibrant green broccoli florets in a rich and creamy sauce, topped with a generous layer of melty cheese and a sprinkle of crispy breadcrumbs. The chef who leaked this recipe out to the public really took one for the team, and we can never thank him enough. It's the perfect combination of protein, veggies, and all the cheesy goodness your heart desires. Just maybe pair it with a side salad to pretend you're being healthy. Chicken divan casserole is the retro dish of every cheese lover's dreams, and you know what that calls for? A comeback. It's a classic at throwback parties, but you don't really need an excuse to cook this up. A typical Tuesday night works too. Slow cooking was once an art form, and few dishes showcased it better than a well-braised short rib. This was a meal that required patience. Tough cuts of beef transformed into fork-tender perfection after hours of simmering in a rich, aromatic sauce. Deeply savory, fall-off-the-bone ribs were the reward for anyone willing to wait. Short ribs were once considered a budget cut, prized not for their tenderness, but for their flavor when cooked properly. Unlike steaks or roasts, these ribs needed time and care to break down the tough connective tissue. The solution was a slow braise in red wine, broth, and aromatic vegetables. Over several hours, the flavors deepened, and the meat absorbed every note of the wine's richness, creating a dish that was as elegant as it was hearty. For much of the 20th century, this was a homecoming dinner classic, perfect for cold evenings and special occasions. But as cooking habits changed, so did the popularity of slow-braised dishes. People wanted quick meals, not ones that took all afternoon. Short ribs also became more expensive as demand for premium beef cuts soared, making them less common in everyday kitchens. gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. Which forgotten summer dinner surprised you most? Tell us in the comments, tap like if you felt a spark of nostalgia, and subscribe for more meals time left behind.